Our last speaker of this session is Ed Inscho from the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Okay, thanks. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be visiting today and participating in this conference. And it's also my pleasure to take you to a journey to the kidney. Many of us in the kidney field consider it to be the brain of the cardiovascular system, so I guess you'll get a chance to see it from my perspective. My interest really lies in the control of renal hemodynamics, particularly as it relates to the control of the microvasculature. The kidney also receives about 20% of the cardiac output, a sizable chunk of the load. The kidney, however, gets it for its job primarily of cleansing metabolic byproducts and also for the job of balancing sodium and extracellular fluid volume so that blood pressure ends up being controlled. It also accomplishes that task by controlling renal blood flow within very fine marks and thereby controlling glomerular filtration rate, which on a good day, with everything working correctly in humans, will filter the plasma volume about 60 times a day. What I'm going to cover today in this brief overview, it's sort of a high-level overview, are the techniques that are currently available to study the renal microcirculation. I'll give you some idea of the advantages and disadvantages of some of those. We'll go over a little bit about regulatory control. We'll talk a little bit about what little is thought to be known about what the potential mechanosensor might be in the renal vasculature, which I think is a really important question for us. And then in the meantime, we'll go over some of the impacts of hypertension, inflammation, high dietary salt, and so on, and how it affects the autoregulatory mechanism. So what techniques do we have available to us? Probably the best technique that has been used for the lion's share of this work has been the isolated perfused tubule. It does give you direct access to the vasculature. You get to see clear demarcation of the vessel borders. The limitations are it's been removed from the kidney. It's very hard to take the kidney apart, particularly as it pertains to vascular function, because vascular function in the kidney is very closely tied to tubular function and also to the relationship of the vascular-tubular network, or association. So in these isolated preparations, you lose that tubular and vascular network, and so you get changes in vascular function that go with that. Another modification of this is the hydronephrotic kidney model. This is one that arises from ureteral ligation. You get clear images of what the vasculature looks like, but these kidneys are also virtually anephric. So again, the nephrovascular unit relationship has been eliminated in this preparation. Technique I'm going to show you most of the work from today is called the blood perfused juxtamedullary nephron technique. It's an in vitro preparation. It's a blood perfused kidney. The blood that we use is a plasma vehicle with red blood cells suspended within. It functions very nicely and actually generates endogenous tone. So if you want to study vasodilatory mechanisms, you don't have to superimpose phenylephrine or norepinephrine like you do in an isolated perfused kidney sort of a preparation. More recently, techniques have been developed to apply dual photon confocal microscopy, both in vitro, but also in vivo. And in vivo is a very striking one because it actually gives you access to the vasculature, maintaining the relationship of the vasculature with the tubule. And it also gives you a look at the superficial nephrons, the ones at the sort of the outer region of the kidney, whereas the juxtamedullary nephron preparation gives you only access to the deep nephrons, and those are different in many ways in that they perfuse the medulla, whereas the superficial nephrons are probably more representative of the rest of the vasculature out in the outer and mid-cortex. This is just an image of what this preparation looks like, and it gives you an idea of what a blood-perfused glomerulus looks like in this in vitro preparation. You can see the blood cells percolating through the glomerular tuft. You can see the urinary space there on the left of the screen. But what's important about this, I think, is that these glomerular capillaries lie in this urinary space almost in a tuft. They don't have the support of adjacent tissue. They lay in there like grapes on a vine. And so if you don't control glomerular capillary pressure correctly, this glomerulus is going to expand by virtue of the increased hydrostatic pressure. Eventually, it'll have inflammatory things, deposition of extracellular matrix. This glomerulus will sclerose and be lost. And that's the process that autoregulation is responsible for. Here, autoregulation is just to regulate blood flow within tight constraints over a very broad range of pressures. I have here depicted 190 millimeters of mercury or so. That's actually quite realistic. And it does it by simply adjusting vascular resistance to increase resistance as pressure goes up, decrease resistance as pressure goes down. In so doing, controlling renal blood flow, controlling GFR by virtue of controlling glomerular capillary pressure. In vivo, glomerular capillary pressure averages about 60 millimeters of mercury, which is substantially higher than most other capillary beds, but it subserves the bulk flow phenomenon that we need in order to process this much plasma on a daily basis. Autoregulation has been studied for a long time. We know quite a few things about autoregulation. We know that it involves largely the myogenic response inherent to all vascular smooth muscle, but the kidney also adds in an additional feature in the tubular-glomerular feedback mechanism, which is an articulation between the macula densa of the distal nephron with the afferent arteriole that perfuse its own glomerulus to really fine-tune glomerular filtration pressure. Together, TGF and the myogenic response contribute to the overall autoregulation of glomerular hemodynamics and thereby can control a constant renal blood flow, a constant glomerular capillary pressure in the face of an increase in transmural pressure. That's the way it works, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about of how we actually accomplish that. This is another image of an afferent arteriole. The glomerulus is someplace up in this direction. This particular arteriole is a little under 13 microns in diameter. You can see the laminar blood flow of the red blood cells as it traffics through the arteriole. You can see the plasma skimming layer, and you can see here, using international units, that it's about 3 digits in diameter. Just now at 5 minutes, we changed the perfusion pressure from 100 to 65 millimeters of mercury. We lose the image for just a moment, but you can still see the vessel's already growing in size, decreasing resistance to allow blood flow to stay constant in the face of a lower perfusion pressure. This is in vitro, but does it without the impact of nerves, without any other influences other than the ones inherent to the kidney. So a normal autoregulatory profile for a collection of vessels looks something like this here shown in the blue circles. The control diameter of the control data will always be blue in this presentation. But this is what it looks like in an Inscho hypertensive animal. It's been hypertensive for a period of about 10 days. Obviously, we get a nice steep slope in the control condition, and we get a very flat pressure diameter relationship in the hypertensive animals. These are glomeruli taken from a kidney from a hypertensive animal. You can see marked glomerular expansion, deposition of extracellular matrix, lots of inflammation, whereas a normal, healthy, pink-looking normotensive glomerulus is what we really want to try to preserve. These are in serious jeopardy, and this is what contributes to the progression to kidney failure in hypertension, diabetes, high dietary salt, lupus erythematosus, all kinds of different pathological conditions that the kidney undergoes. So what do we know about how all of this works? Our pet hypothesis, which I'm not going to go into greatly, is that the autoregulatory adjustment of resistance occurs through P2 receptor activation. The point of showing you this slide is to show you what a normal autoregulatory response looks like and what it looks like during P2 receptor blockade, P2X receptor blockade. Instead of getting a passive relationship like you might expect if you've eliminated all tension-generating capacity, what you get is something in between, a flat pressure diameter relationship, even though perfusion pressures increase from 100 to 160 over this span. So what's holding it in this particular place? The answer is we really don't know, but this is an interesting phenomenon that you're going to see over and over again. If you do the same sort of maneuver in a mouse model, this is a rat, this is a mouse, normal autoregulatory profile in the wild type, in animals lacking the P2X1 receptor, you see again a flat pressure diameter relationship, indicating that the autoregulatory response at the very least is markedly impaired, but there's something that's holding diameter stable in the face of a fairly substantial increase in hydrostatic pressure. If you look in the hypertensive model, again, you see the same kind of thing. I've shown you this once before. This is in the DOCA salt model, a different form of hypertension, low angiotensin hypertension, but you get pretty much the same profile. And this is a little different experiment. This is a paired experiment in the control conditions and during exposure to TGF-beta, about 10 to 15 minutes of TGF-beta exposure. And again, you've totally eliminated this autoregulatory vasoconstrictor response. So it leads to several questions. Why does this happen? Is it simply that the mechanosensor has been inactivated and we don't know, the vessel simply doesn't know that pressure has changed? That would lead to really no change in diameter. Could be enhanced active tension generation through other mechanisms. It could also be that there are other autoregulatory mechanisms that we don't know about. There has been a third factor that's been suggested by some, even a fourth mechanism. Those are really not very well described or understood, but it's still possible that other mechanisms still exist. Most of the autoregulatory response that we see is myogenic in nature. The TGF is almost like the fine adjustment on the microscope. You use it in just to bring in those last little bits. The myogenic response is responsible for the most of it. And it includes a whole bunch of things that people have implicated in the myogenic reactivity. But what we still don't really know is what the mechanosensor is. What is this element that signals change in transmural pressure to give you this increase in vascular smooth muscle contraction? And for the kidney, it's extremely important. Well, several years ago, Jernigan and Drummond put forth a hypothesis that this myogenic response down here in cerebral and interlobar arteries really arose from either ENaC that's expressed by vascular smooth muscle or an ENaC-like protein complex in the vasculature. And the hypothesis arose because there was a fair amount of data in other cell types that argued that ENaC-like complexes can function as mechanosensors. So she did some experiments using isolated pressurized mouse interlobar arteries. And here is basically what her myogenic response looks like. It's modest, but nevertheless, with an increase in intraluminal pressure, she would get a reduction in diameter. If she eliminated calcium from the extracellular fluid, she indeed got that passive relationship that you would expect if all constrictor activity was lost. Translating that into myogenic tone, you get a good myogenic response under the control condition. And then when you block or you treat with either amiloride here on the left or benzamyl here on the right, you can eliminate that increase in myogenic tone simply by inhibiting ENaC with these fairly specific ENaC inhibitors. We were a little skeptical of these data, so we tried it in our own preparation. But basically, the short story is we got the same thing. We had to use slightly higher concentrations of amiloride and benzamyl, but nevertheless, in the presence of amiloride and in the presence of benzamyl, we lost our pressure-dependent autoregulatory response and again returned to a very flat pressure-diameter relationship. So what's the impact of inflammation on this? We're going to change the stories a little bit, but it might actually turn out to be sort of the same story. Inflammation's a big deal in the kidney. These are studies that were done out of Dr. Cowley's group showing the effects of hypertension in a adult salt-sensitive rat in an interesting model where he's got one kidney exposed to uncontrolled hypertension, the same kidney and the opposite kidney in the same rat exposed to the same humoral conditions, but where blood pressure is actually controlled with a clamp in front of the kidney. And then, of course, the comparator down here is the sham. And you can see normal healthy tissue down here in the sham. The controlled kidney, which is a hypertensive rat, but the pressures in the kidney are normal. You see fairly normal-looking glomeruli, normal medullary interstitium. But in the uncontrolled kidney, massive expansion of the glomerulus, large cast formation in the cortex and in the medulla, consistent with marked renal impairment. If you looked at inflammatory mediators, you see marked increases in fibronectin. Serious red is an indicator of fibrosis. Increases in TGF-beta, which I'll come back to, and then NF-kappa B compared to what you see in the control. So inflammation is a major part of the renal response or renal consequence of hypertension. Where does it factor into the overall autoregulatory performance? This, again, are those same data I showed you earlier, 15 minutes of TGF-beta exposure. If you wash the TGF-beta away, you get partial recovery. We washed here for 20 minutes. You get partial recovery. I think if we'd washed longer, we'd have gotten full recovery. But for other reasons, other data that we had, we were suspicious of reactive oxygen species in this process. And so when we looked over here, if we did the same experiment in the presence of TGF-beta, but also in the presence of tempo or apocyanin, you completely abrogate that effect of TGF-beta to eliminate autoregulatory adjustments and resistance. Sort of from the same approach, if we looked at non-specific anti-inflammatories, pentasan polysulfate, mycophenolate mofetil, or clopidogrel, you can see in each case we go from a flat, impaired autoregulatory performance to a completely normalized autoregulatory performance as indicated by these green lines. So, early intervention with anti-inflammatories in the hypertensive cascade protects the kidney against loss of function, and as a consequence then would protect the glomeruli, protect the downstream tubular elements from damage due to the hypertension. Is this physiological or is it pharmacological? We always were thinking about it being just a pathophysiologic response to high blood pressure. But we did some experiments where we simply manipulated dietary salt. And here, so we see that an animal that's subjected to 14 days of just an 8% salt diet, you see marked, again, impairment of the autoregulatory response. These animals are completely normotensive. If you look at systolic blood pressure, it only increases by about 8 or so millimeters of mercury. So these kidneys are in good shape. They're not seeing hypertensive pressures, but nevertheless, they're seeing impairment of the autoregulatory response. This really got us to start thinking about this in a different way. You know, is this really pathophysiology, or is this the kidney's effort to try to facilitate elimination of this excess dietary salt in the case of the high salt diet, or in hypertension to excrete enhanced amounts of extracellular fluid in an effort to control the blood pressure and bring it back into normal controls? If we look further in these high salt animals and treat either with Tempol or with epicinin, just kind of like in the TGF-beta condition, we get complete normalization. Now, these animals have been eating salt for 14 days. This is only 10 to 15 minutes of exposure to Tempol or epicinin. So these vessels aren't changed. They're just under a different environmental influence that in this particular case involves reactive oxygen species. You quell the ROS influence and you revert this right back to a normally functioning kidney.
Ed, can you summarize? Your
Yes.
time's up.
All right. One last point here. It's not that simple because in our case, superoxide is actually inhibiting the autoregulatory response. These are some data from Dr. Wilcox's group where he shows that actually, in his case, using mouse perfused arterioles, the superoxide is actually found to be necessary for the myogenic response. We don't know the reason for these differences. It could be mouse versus rat. It could be isolated perfused arteriole versus blood perfused. Nevertheless, it's not going to be that clear, so we need to know more about that. So the lessons learned: afferent arterioles have nice, robust autoregulatory capability that is markedly impaired by hypertension, inflammation, diabetes, which I didn't talk with you about, but is still the same, and high dietary salt. This autoregulatory loss of function, it manifests always as a flat pressure diameter relationship. So there's some other influence that's maintaining diameter of these vessels in the face of increases in hydrostatic pressure. And then the reactive oxygen species clearly play an important role in this. What challenges lie ahead? Well, we really need to know a lot more about how this autoregulatory mechanism works and what accounts for these latching, if you will, of preglomerular resistance under these increases in hydrostatic pressure. We need to know more about the differences between the cortical and the medullary circulation, because medullary blood flow is probably controlled separately or differently than cortical blood flow. We need to know what the mechanosensor is and how does it work. We need to know more about how environmental conditions change this, because that's what the kidney's doing, is responding to environmental conditions, and it needs to be able to respond appropriately without injuring itself, which may be what's happening. And we also need to know more about how ROS and other things factor in. In addition to the fact, we also need to know more about sex differences. There's virtually no data at all on sex differences in the behavior of this vasculature. So thank you very much for your attention.
So we have time for maybe one or two quick questions. Jonathan?
I'm sorry if I may have missed it. I had to run out just for a second. But the question is ROS and ENaC. How do you link them together directly?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think we can at this point. The ENaC hypothesis is one that has not been generally well accepted. Part of the reason being you need so much of these blockers in order to get good blockade. At the lower concentration, we couldn't block. At higher concentrations, we could. And that sort of fits with what we know about tubular epithelia. You know, that there are low levels in the plasma, but the nephron concentrates it, so when it gets out to the distal nephron, it's actually in a much higher concentration. So we don't know the answer to that yet.
Could it involve ryanodine receptors and the effect of ROS and ryanodine receptors and the fact that ENaC will control sodium and affect sodium and calcium loading? Calcium we haven't heard about
Yeah,
too much lately.
I think it could from that standpoint, but really this autoregulatory mechanism is almost exclusively L channel. Very little store-related function there. There's some, but not a lot. It's mostly influx. Yeah.
One last question for the discussion.
Ariel Gomez, Charlottesville. Beautiful work and review as usual. I wonder what might be the role of cell-to-cell communication, such as connexins, panexins, and many of the others. Have you thought of or done any of this work?
You know, that's a very good question, because the one thing that's missing in all of this, that, you know, we see this impaired function, but we haven't changed the tubular feedback element. That is still there. It's still operating. It's generally held to be really having its greatest effect right at the junction of the afferent arteriole with the glomerulus. But because of these cell-to-cell connections, it can propagate retrograde along the arteriole. So it could still be holding some degree of tone as a function of increased tubular perfusion rate. If you increase tubular perfusion, increase GFR, the feedback influence will be greater, and it may be working backward. We can check that with like papillectomy or something to eliminate that feedback response. We just haven't done it yet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So why don't we, oh, go ahead. Okay.